At 2:17 inches the morning, in the silence of the Mojave Desert, something appeared on a screen that wasn't supposed to exist, and within minutes, it would force some of the most advanced space agencies on Earth into complete silence. This wasn't a glitch, it wasn't interference, and it definitely wasn't random noise. It was precise, controlled, and sitting at a frequency every advanced civilization in the universe would recognize instantly. The Goldstone Deep Space Communications Complex lies about 60 miles northeast of Barstow, surrounded by miles of empty desert. It's one of the most critical nodes in NASA's Deep Space Network, responsible for communicating with spacecraft millions, even billions of kilometers away. On October 17, 2025, during a routine overnight shift, a radio engineer was doing something he had done hundreds of times before. He was running a standard gain calibration on the massive 70-meter dish. Nothing unusual, nothing exciting, just another quiet shift. He had a thermos of coffee sitting beside him and a calibration log open on a secondary monitor. The main display showed a live frequency spectrum of the sky region the antenna was tracking. At that moment, he wasn't even paying attention to it. He was writing notes, following a routine that had become almost automatic over time. Then something changed. He glanced up and froze. A single line had appeared on the spectrum. It hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. It was narrow, extremely clean, and positioned at exactly 1.42 gigahertz. No drift, no noise. Just a perfect, steady spike cutting through the background. He put his pen down. For 4 seconds, he didn't move. He just stared at it. Then he acted. He immediately initiated the interference rejection protocol. This system automatically filters out every common source of false signals, terrestrial radio interference, satellite spillover, even internal hardware noise. It's designed to eliminate anything that could be mistaken for a real astronomical source. If the signal was fake, it would vanish. But it didn't. It became sharper. That's when he picked up the phone and called his supervisor, not through the normal reporting system, but directly. Before the supervisor even reached the console, the engineer said 4 simple words. "It is not us." By 3:45 UTC, the signal had been confirmed using a second antenna at Goldstone. By 4:30 UTC, an independent observatory in Australia detected the same transmission. By 5:15 UTC, a European tracking station in Argentina locked onto it as well. 3 continents. 3 completely different systems. 1 identical signal, and it wasn't random. The transmission repeated on a strict cycle every 47 minutes, with internal patterns repeating every 11.3 seconds. Inside those patterns were even smaller modulations, layered in a structure so precise that it didn't match anything in the known catalog of natural cosmic signals. The source had already been identified. It was coming from an object known as 3I Atlas. And what it was sending, no agency has publicly explained to this day. To understand why this matters, you need to understand the frequency itself. 1.42 gigahertz is not just another number. It is one of the most important frequencies in all of physics. It is known as the hydrogen line, the exact frequency emitted when a hydrogen atom undergoes a specific quantum transition. Hydrogen, the simplest and most abundant element in the universe, makes up about 75% of all visible matter. Every galaxy, every nebula, every region of interstellar space. Hydrogen is everywhere, and this frequency is universal. It is the same in every corner of the cosmos. Any civilization advanced enough to study basic quantum mechanics would eventually discover it. That's why scientists consider it a kind of cosmic meeting point, a shared channel where intelligent life might choose to listen or transmit. Researchers even call this region of the spectrum the water hole, because it's naturally quiet and ideal for detecting signals against the background noise of space. And 3i Atlas wasn't just near that frequency. It was locked onto it with precision. That detail is critical, because natural hydrogen emissions from comets or gas clouds don't produce clean, narrow signals. They create broad, messy distributions of energy. What appeared on that screen at Goldstone was the opposite, a tight, controlled line, exactly where a deliberate transmitter would place it. That alone raised serious questions. But the timing structure made it impossible to ignore. Natural sources, like pulsars and magnetars, produce repeating signals, but their patterns are simple, based on rotation or magnetic cycles. They don't create layered timing systems, with multiple repeating intervals nested inside each other. This signal did. It behaved more like a communication system than a natural phenomenon. Multiple layers, multiple time scales, all synchronized. After analyzing every known natural explanation, the team studying the data reached a conclusion that changed everything. There was a 99.7% probability that the signal was artificial. Not likely, not possibly, artificial. And here's what makes this moment even more important: this conclusion was reached before anything else happened. Before the signal intensified, before it changed behavior, before it did something that no natural source in the universe has ever done. Because just 3 days later, the situation escalated, and what happened next turned a strange signal into something far more difficult to explain. If you want to understand what this object did next, stay with me, because this is where the story stops being unusual and starts becoming impossible. Because 3 days after that first detection, the signal didn't fade, it didn't drift, and it didn't behave like any natural source ever recorded. It evolved. And that single change is what forced scientists to stop asking if the signal was artificial and start asking what it was trying to do. In the hours following its discovery, the transmission from 3i Atlas didn't weaken the way a natural event would. Instead, it grew stronger. Over a 5-hour observation window, its intensity increased by nearly 300%. That alone broke expectations. Natural radio emissions from space, whether from gas clouds, comets, or transient bursts, tend to dissipate as energy spreads out into the vacuum. They don't ramp up in power on a clean, measurable schedule. But this one did. It was as if whatever was generating the signal was increasing output deliberately, step by step, following a pattern that wasn't tied to any known physical process. And while that was happening, the internal structure of the signal remained perfectly stable. The 4-7-minute repetition cycle held. The 11-3-second intervals continued without deviation. And within those intervals, the smaller 1-7-second subpatterns flickered with the same precise timing. That consistency matters, because maintaining that level of timing accuracy requires control. It requires a system capable of tracking time, managing output, and sustaining stability across multiple layers simultaneously. Nature doesn't do that, not with this level of precision. Then came October 20th. At exactly 11:15 p.m. Eastern Time, something changed. The signal, which had been broadcasting outward in all directions like ripples on water, suddenly collapsed inward. Not gradually, not randomly, but instantly. It narrowed into a focused beam, and it stayed that way for exactly 8 minutes and 24 seconds. Observatories across the globe saw it happen at the same time. Facilities in Chile, Hawaii, and Australia all confirmed the same behavior. The transmission was no longer spreading out across space. It was concentrated, directed, and held steady on a single line. It wasn't sweeping like a pulsar beam. It wasn't rotating or drifting. It was locked. And the direction it was locked onto was unmistakable. It was pointed at Earth. That detail changes the entire interpretation. Because focusing electromagnetic energy across hundreds of millions of kilometers is not something that happens by accident. It requires an aperture, an antenna, or structure designed to shape and direct the signal. It also requires active control, because both the source and the target are moving through space at high velocity. To maintain alignment, adjustments must be constant and precise. Natural objects don't do that. Comets don't have antennas. Asteroids don't track targets. And yet, for those 8 minutes and 24 seconds, 3I Atlas behaved exactly like a system designed to transmit information to a specific destination. Now consider the timing. This focused transmission occurred just 9 days before the object was set to enter solar conjunction, the period when it would pass behind the Sun and become completely unobservable from Earth. That window matters because it represents the last moment when direct communication could occur before the Sun's radiation would block all signals. And that's exactly when the beam appeared. Not earlier. Not later. Right before the blackout. That suggests planning, because if this were random, the timing would not align so perfectly with the last available observation window. But if it were intentional, then this was the final opportunity to deliver something specific before going dark. And that raises the most important question so far. What was sent during those 8 minutes and 24 seconds? Because everything about the signal, its frequency, its structure, its timing points to communication. Not noise, not a passive emission, a system carrying layered information across multiple scales. And yet, despite weeks of analysis by some of the most advanced teams on Earth, no official statement has ever described the content of that transmission. Not from NASA. Not from the European Space Agency. Not from any major institution involved in the detection. Instead, something else happened. Within hours of the third independent confirmation, a protocol was activated, a protocol that has never been publicly detailed. Its steps were clear. Verify the data, alert government and military contacts, and initiate a 72-hour communication blackout. And that's exactly what followed. For 3 days, there was no public information. Then the blackout ended. But the silence didn't. 5 days passed. Then 10. No press releases. No technical briefings. No acknowledgement that anything unusual had occurred. Even the International Astronomical Union, which typically reports minor discoveries almost immediately, released nothing. Every organization that had access to the data went quiet at the same time. And while they remained silent, the signal didn't stop. It continued. It evolved. And what happened next pushed this event beyond radio signals and into something visible, something that telescopes could actually see forming on the surface of the object itself. Because in the days leading up to solar conjunction, observatories began recording something far more complex than a transmission. They began to see patterns, not random reflections, not surface irregularities, but structured, repeating formations of light moving across the object in ways that suggested coordination, not chaos. And once those patterns were confirmed, the situation changed again, because now, whatever was transmitting wasn't just sending signals into space. It was doing something physical, something visible. And what those patterns revealed next made the signal itself look simple by comparison. If you want to understand what scientists saw forming on 3I Atlas before it disappeared behind the Sun, stay with me, because this is where the story takes a turn no one was prepared for. Because as the signal continued and the silence from official channels deepened, telescopes around the world began to capture something that could no longer be explained as a radio anomaly alone. For the first time, whatever was happening on 3I Atlas became visible, and what observers saw raised even more questions than the transmission itself. In the days leading up to solar conjunction, major observatories in Chile, Hawaii, and Spain shifted their focus. They weren't just tracking radio data anymore. They began analyzing reflected light from the object's surface, looking for any physical changes that might explain the signal behavior. What they found was unexpected. Across multiple observation windows, teams reported structured light patterns moving across the surface of the object. These weren't random flashes caused by sunlight hitting uneven terrain. They were organized, repeating formations that maintained their shape even as the object rotated. That detail is critical, because when a natural body rotates, any reflected light patterns shift unpredictably. Shadows change, angles vary, and brightness fluctuates based on surface irregularities. But what was observed here did not behave that way. The patterns held their geometry. They moved in coordinated sequences, and they repeated. One of the first formations described by observers consisted of triangular light clusters rotating in unison. These shapes appeared, shifted position, and reappeared in the same configuration over extended periods. They were not static reflections. They were dynamic, controlled, and consistent. Then the structure became more complex. Observers reported 3 concentric spiral formations layered over each other. These spirals remained stable for hours, maintaining symmetry and proportion despite the object's rotation and the changing angle of solar illumination. That level of stability should not exist on a natural surface, because maintaining a geometric pattern under those conditions requires control over either the emission of light or the surface properties themselves. In either case, it implies an active system, not a passive rock. And here's what makes this even more significant. These visual patterns appeared at the same time the radio signal was continuing its structured transmission. The timing was not random. The optical data and the radio data were overlapping, suggesting that whatever process was generating the signal might also be responsible for what telescopes were seeing. In other words, the object was not just transmitting, it was doing something physical at the same time. Then came the moment that shifted the entire analysis from unusual to fundamentally incompatible with known physics. As 3I Atlas approached perihelion, the point in its orbit closest to the Sun, its velocity should have increased. That's not a theory. That's a basic law of orbital mechanics. As an object falls deeper into a gravitational well, it accelerates. Every comet, asteroid, and spacecraft follows this rule. But this object didn't. It slowed down, not briefly, not within margin of error. It showed a sustained, measurable decrease in velocity at the exact point where it should have been moving the fastest. That detail is impossible to ignore, because there are only a few known ways for an object in space to lose speed. Atmospheric drag is one, but there is no atmosphere in deep space. Gravitational interaction is another, but near perihelion, gravity increases velocity, not reduces it. Outgassing can create small changes in motion, but those changes are chaotic, inconsistent, and rarely aligned in a single direction. What was observed here was none of those. The deceleration was smooth. It was directional, and it directly opposed the gravitational pull of the Sunday. That is not passive behavior. That is controlled thrust. This wasn't speculation. The data was analyzed and confirmed by multiple sources, including orbital models from NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Independent observatories cross-checked the measurements using astrometric tracking. The results matched. The object was actively reducing its speed, and it was doing so at the most critical point in its trajectory. Think about what that means. To counteract solar gravity at perihelion, the object would need to generate a force strong enough to offset the acceleration caused by the Sunday. That requires energy, it requires direction, and it requires control. Natural objects do not have that capability. A comet cannot apply reverse thrust. An asteroid cannot choose to slow down. But 3I Atlas did, and it did so just before disappearing behind the Sunday. That timing matters, because once the object entered solar conjunction, it would be completely hidden from every radio and optical instrument on Earth. The Sun's radiation creates a noise barrier that blocks detection, making that period effectively a blind spot for all observation systems. And yet, just before entering that blind spot, the object changed its velocity in a controlled way. That suggests preparation. Because if an object is capable of maneuvering, and it chooses to do so right before becoming unobservable, then whatever happens next will occur without direct monitoring. And that's exactly what happened. 3I Atlas passed behind the Sunday. For 72 hours, it vanished from every tracking system on Earth. No signal, no visual confirmation, nothing. But what appeared during that window was something no one had predicted, something that did not come from deep space, but from much closer to home. Because while the object itself was hidden, the signal didn't completely disappear. It showed up somewhere else. And where it appeared next changed the scope of this entire event from a distant anomaly to something interacting with Earth itself. If you want to understand what scientists detected during those 72 hours of total blackout, stay with me, because this is where the story stops being distant and starts getting much closer. Because during those 72 hours, when 3I Atlas was completely hidden behind the sun, when every telescope and radio dish on Earth had effectively gone blind, something unexpected happened. The signal didn't vanish, it reappeared. But this time, it wasn't coming from deep space. It was coming from above. While the object remained undetectable due to solar interference, multiple monitoring systems across Earth began picking up a familiar pattern. The same repeating structure, the same timing intervals, the same unmistakable signature that had first appeared at Goldstone, a 4-7-minute cycle, an 11.3-second internal rhythm, nested subpatterns repeating at 1-7-second intervals. It was identical, but the direction was completely different. Instead of arriving from millions of kilometers away, the signal was being detected as if it were originating within Earth's own upper atmosphere. Not from the ground, not from orbiting satellites, from the boundary region between the atmosphere and space, the ionosphere. This wasn't a single detection. The Very Large Array recorded it. Ionospheric research stations in Alaska and Norway confirmed it independently. Even the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization picked up corresponding patterns through its global monitoring systems. 3 separate systems, different purposes, different technologies, same signal, and the timing aligned perfectly with the blackout window. That detail matters more than anything else, because during those 72 hours, the original source, 3I Atlas, was completely blocked by the Sunday. There was no direct line of sight, no possible way for standard detection systems to receive a signal from that direction. Yet the signal persisted, which means one of two things had to be happening. Either the transmission was being relayed, picked up by a secondary object positioned somewhere between Atlas and Earth, then retransmitted toward the planet, or something within Earth's near-space environment was interacting with the signal and reproducing it. Both explanations are extraordinary, because neither one belongs to any known natural category. The ionosphere can reflect certain radio frequencies, but not with this level of precision, not with this level of structural integrity. Reflected signals degrade, they scatter, they lose coherence. What was observed here retained every detail of the original transmission, every layer, every timing interval, every modulation. It was not distortion, it was preservation. That suggests something more than reflection. It suggests interaction. Now step back and consider the sequence again. First, a signal appears at the most universal frequency in the cosmos, the hydrogen line. Then it reveals a layered, structured timing system consistent with communication protocols. Then it intensifies over time instead of fading. Then it focuses into a directed beam aimed at Earth during the final observable window. Then the source disappears behind the Sunday. And during that disappearance, the same signal appears in Earth's upper atmosphere. That is not a random chain of events. That is a progression. Each step builds on the previous one. Each step increases complexity, and each step reduces the probability of coincidence. Because if this were a natural phenomenon, every stage would need its own independent explanation. But those explanations would also need to align perfectly in timing, structure, and behavior. The likelihood of that is effectively zero. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the atmospheric signal stopped. At the exact moment 3I Atlas was expected to re-emerge from behind the Sunday. That timing is not subtle, it is precise. Which brings us to what happened next. As the object became visible again, telescopes reacquired it almost immediately. Its position was measured, tracked, and compared against all previous orbital predictions. And that's when the next anomaly appeared. Its trajectory had changed. Not dramatically. Not enough to cause panic at first glance, but enough that every model built before the occultation was now incorrect. The object was not where it was supposed to be. And more importantly, the difference could not be explained by any known gravitational influence. No nearby planet could have caused it. No known force in that region of space could account for the shift, which means the adjustment happened during the blackout window. While the object was completely unobservable, that is a critical point, because it eliminates the possibility of measurement error. The change didn't appear gradually. It appeared instantly, from the perspective of observers. Before conjunction, one trajectory. After conjunction, another, and no data in between. That gap matters, because it creates a window where something could happen without being seen, and something did. The magnitude and direction of the shift point to a controlled maneuver, not a passive drift, not a gravitational deflection, but a deliberate adjustment of motion. Once again, the pattern holds. Signal, structure, beam, deceleration, atmospheric interaction, and now, course correction. Each step adds a new layer of evidence. Each step moves further away from natural explanation, and each step points toward the same underlying conclusion. This object is not behaving like a comet. It is behaving like a system that transmits, a system that adjusts, and a system that operates with timing that aligns perfectly with observation windows. That last detail may be the most important, because if the object is capable of changing its behavior based on when it can or cannot be observed, then it is not just acting, it is responding. And if it is responding, then the next question is unavoidable. Responding to what? Because everything up to this point suggests that the signal was not just being sent into space. It was being sent with awareness of where it would be received. And what happened next forces us to confront that possibility directly, because once the full sequence was analyzed, the focus shifted away from how the signal was transmitted and toward what it actually contained. If you want to understand why no agency has released that information publicly, stay with me, because this is where the story reaches its most important question. Because once the full sequence was assembled, every detection, every anomaly, every shift in behavior, the focus changed completely. It was no longer about whether the signal was artificial. That question had already been answered with 99.7% certainty. The real question now was far more difficult to confront. What was actually inside the transmission? By the time 3I Atlas reappeared from solar conjunction, analysts across multiple agencies had already spent weeks examining the original data. The narrowband signal at 1.42 GHz was only the outer layer. Beneath it was a deeply structured system of timing intervals and nested patterns that suggested something far more complex than a simple broadcast.